At 12:37 in the morning on the south side of Chicago, a Cadillac rolled to a stop outside a quiet apartment building. Inside sat Willie Fluky Stokes, a man who had spent years building a legend out of money, fear, loyalty, and spectacle. But that night, there were no diamonds flashing under the streetlights, no silk suit, no crowd watching him like a king. Just a driver in the front seat, a woman reaching for grocery bags, and a bodyguard waiting behind them. Then two men stepped out of the darkness. Glass shattered. Gunfire tore through the car, and the man paid to protect Fluky raised his weapon, fired into the air, and let the killers walk away. This was not just a murder. It was the final scene of a legend Fluky had written himself. Long before the gunfire, before the betrayal, before the Cadillac became a coffin, Willie Fluky Stokes was already larger than life on the South Side. In the streets of Chicago during the 1970s and early 1980s, people knew his name before they knew his story. They saw the Cadillacs first. They saw the diamond rings, the tailored clothes, the gold bracelets stacked on his arms, the kind of flash that made strangers turn their heads and whisper. Fluky did not simply arrive anywhere. He appeared like a man who understood that power was not only something you had, it was something people had to see. But what made him dangerous was not just the money. It was the way he mixed fear with generosity. To some families, Fluky was the man who handed out cash when rent was overdue. He was the man who helped people when a house burned down, who gave turkeys away during the holidays, who sponsored neighborhood kids who wanted to play ball. On a block where many people felt forgotten by the city, Fluky made people feel seen. He remembered names. He shook hands. He made himself available in a way that politicians often did not. And that is what made his legend complicated. Because behind the warm handshakes and the neighborhood favors, law enforcement believed there was another empire operating in the shadows. Reports described drug houses running day and night, workers on payroll, money moving through the South Side in amounts most people could barely imagine. Officially, Fluky often presented himself as a gambler, a man who won and lost heavily in Las Vegas, a man whose fortune could be explained by luck, risk, and dice. But investigators believed luck was only the mask. They saw a man who understood image better than almost anyone around him. If the public saw the jewelry, the charity, the Cadillacs, and the confidence, maybe they would not look too closely at the fear underneath. If the neighborhood saw him as a protector, maybe silence would protect him in return. That was the strange power of Fluky Stokes. He could be remembered by one person as a criminal, by another as a benefactor, and by a third as both at the same time. So what happens when a man becomes too powerful to be judged simply? What happens when the same streets that fear him also mourn him? For years, Fluky seemed untouchable. Police watched, rivals waited, the community whispered, and through it all, he kept moving through Chicago like a king in motion. But every king has one place where power cannot protect him. For Fluky Stokes, that place was family. To understand why Fluky's world began to crack, you have to understand the South Side during those years. Chicago in the late 1970s and early 1980s was not just a city of neighborhoods. It was a city of invisible borders. One block could know one set of rules, while the next block lived under another. People learned where to walk, who to greet, what not to ask, and when silence was safer than curiosity. For men like Fluky Stokes, power came from structure. There were territories, there were relationships, there were people who owed favors, people who feared consequences, and people who understood that survival often meant staying loyal to the strongest name on the street. It was brutal, but it had an order. Fluky belonged to that older world, a world where reputation had weight, where a name could open doors or close mouths. But by the early 1980s, that order was changing. A new generation was coming up faster, younger, and more reckless. They did not always respect the men who had built their names over decades. They did not care about old alliances. They were not impressed by yesterday's legends. The streets were becoming more unpredictable, and the old rules were no longer enough to keep a man safe. That is what made this period so dangerous. Fluky could still wear the diamonds. He could still ride through Chicago in Cadillacs. He could still hand out cash and make people step aside when he entered a room. But the world around him was no longer the same world that had made him powerful. The greatest threat to an old king is not always the police. It is not always a rival with a bigger gun or a witness willing to speak. Sometimes the real danger is time itself. A new era arrives quietly, then suddenly, and the men who once controlled everything discover that fear does not last forever. Fluky had built a legend on money, loyalty, and image, but image could not stop a new generation from testing him. And when that test finally came, it did not strike first at his empire. It struck at his son. Willie Stokes Jr. was only 28 years old, but on the South Side, he already carried the weight of his father's name. People called him the Wimp, a nickname that sounded soft until you understood the life around him. He dressed with the same kind of confidence people expected from a Stokes. He liked Cadillacs. He liked gambling. He liked the visible symbols of success that had made his father impossible to ignore. But Willie Jr. was not just an image. He was a husband. He was a father of 5 children. And he was the son of a man whose name could open doors, create fear, and attract enemies all at once. That was the danger of being born close to power. You inherited the protection, but you also inherited the target. In February of 1984, that target became real. Willie Jr. went to the Roberts Motel on the South Side, a place tied to business, movement, and risk. What should have been another routine moment became the moment that split Fluky's life in two. Before Willie Jr. could walk away from that night, gunmen struck. The details would become part of South Side memory, but the outcome was brutally simple. Fluky Stokes, a man who had built his name on control, could not protect his own son. There were no clear answers, no clean justice, no public explanation that could make the loss feel understandable. Willie Jr. left behind a wife, 5 children, and a father who now had to face the one thing money could not reverse. For most families, grief pulls people inward. It makes them close the curtains, lower their voices, and bury the pain somewhere private. But Fluky Stokes had never lived privately. His entire life had been built in public, through display, reputation, and the power of being seen. So when death came for his son, Fluky did not answer with silence. He answered with spectacle. And that is where the story left the world of ordinary crime and entered something stranger, darker, and almost impossible to forget. Because Fluky did not simply arrange a funeral, he built a Cadillac for the dead. The Cadillac Coffin was not just expensive, it was not just strange, it was a message. After Willie Jr. was killed, Fluky Stokes went to a custom casket maker with a request so unusual that it sounded less like funeral planning and more like myth-making. He wanted his son buried in the shape of a Cadillac Seville, the kind of car that had already become part of the Stokes family image. To outsiders, it looked outrageous. To Fluky, it may have been the only language that made sense. Because in Fluky's world, style was never decoration. Style was power. So the coffin became a car. It had the look of a Cadillac, the front grille, the white wall tires, the shape and presence of something built to be seen. The details kept growing until the line between vehicle and casket almost disappeared. There were lights. There was a windshield. There was a dashboard. There was a steering wheel. There was even a vanity plate connected to Willie Jr.'s nickname. And then came the viewing. At the funeral home on the South Side, people did not just come to mourn. They came because they had heard rumors about something nobody could quite believe. Lines formed. Word spread. The story became larger with every person who repeated it. Inside, Willie Jr. was not laid flat in the ordinary way. He was placed upright, dressed sharply, positioned behind the wheel as if he were still in motion, still driving, still part of the world he had just left. Money was placed in his hands. Jewelry caught the light. The Cadillac details turned the room into something between a memorial, a warning, and a performance. For some people, it was love. For others, it was madness. For reporters, it was irresistible. But the deeper question is what Fluky was really trying to say. Was this a father refusing to let his son disappear quietly? Was it a final gift from a man who believed that love had to be as large as his reputation? Was it a warning to the streets that even death could not make the Stokes name small? Or was it something more painful than all of that? A man so used to controlling every room he entered that he tried to control grief itself? That is what made the Cadillac Coffin unforgettable. It was flashy on the surface, but underneath the chrome and the lights was a father standing in front of the one thing his money could not fix. He could not bring Willie Jr. back. He could not undo the motel. He could not make 5 children whole again. So he did the only thing Fluky Stokes knew how to do. He made sure the world would never look away, and it did not. The funeral became a story. The story became a rumor. The rumor traveled across cities, across newspapers, across breakfast tables, until a songwriter far from Chicago saw it and understood something immediately. This was no longer just a funeral. This was already becoming a legend. A story like the Cadillac Coffin was never going to stay in one neighborhood. It was too strange, too visual, too American in the darkest possible way. Soon the funeral moved beyond the South Side and into newspapers across the country. People who had never heard of Willie the Wimp Stokes were suddenly reading about a young man buried behind the wheel of a Cadillac-shaped coffin, dressed like he was still headed somewhere, surrounded by the symbols that had defined his short life. Then the story reached Austin, Texas. Songwriter Bill Carter saw it and understood immediately that this was more than a newspaper item. It had rhythm. It had irony. It had tragedy. It had the kind of image a listener could see before the first verse ended. That image became Willie the Wimp. And when Stevie Ray Vaughan later brought the song to a wider audience, the story escaped crime pages completely. It entered bars, stages, records, and radio. People sang along to a funeral they had never attended, about a man they had never met, in a city they may never have visited. That is the strange power of spectacle. Fluky had created a funeral so unforgettable that music carried it farther than fear ever could. But while the world was turning Willie Jr. into a blues legend, Fluky was still alive in Chicago, still surrounded by money, enemies, investigations, and grief. And the next time he returned to the place where his son died, he did not come to mourn. He came to celebrate. Less than a year after burying his son in a Cadillac coffin, Fluky Stokes threw another spectacle. This time, it was not a funeral. It was a wedding anniversary, 30 years with his wife, John. 3 decades of marriage, survival, loyalty, public image, private grief, and a life surrounded by more danger than most couples could ever imagine. For another family, an anniversary after such a loss might have been quiet. A dinner behind closed doors, a room full of relatives speaking softly, a night where the memory of a dead son sat at the table, even if no one said his name. But Fluky did not live quietly. He rented a Southside hotel ballroom. He filled it with guests. Hundreds came through the doors, family, friends, associates, people who wanted to be close to power, and people who simply wanted to witness whatever Fluky Stokes would do next. And he gave them a show. The entertainment was not small. Soul legends performed for the crowd. Music filled the room, the kind of music that made the night feel less like a private anniversary and more like a coronation. Fluky and John stood before everyone, renewing vows in front of a world that had watched their families suffer and still expected them to appear strong. Then came the money. Fluky moved through the crowd, throwing cash into the air, $50 bills and $100 bills floating down like confetti. People reached for them. The room reacted exactly the way a room reacts when money falls from the hands of a man everyone knows is powerful. It was celebration, theater, and control all at once. The price of the night was reported at around $200,000. When asked about it, Fluky reportedly called it modest. That word said almost everything. Because for Fluky, modesty was not about smallness. It was about daring people to understand the scale he considered normal. A $200,000 party, famous performers, cash reigning over guests. And somehow in his world, that could still be described as restrained. But the most haunting detail was not the cost. It was the location. The party took place at the same hotel where Willie Jr. had been killed. That single fact changes the meaning of the entire night. A father returned to the place where his son's life ended, not with silence, not with candles, not with a private prayer, but with music, money, and a room full of witnesses. Was he reclaiming the space? Was he refusing to let grief own it? Was he proving to the streets that no wound could make him hide? Or was this what denial looks like when a man has enough money to decorate it? That is what made Fluky so difficult to understand. He did not move away from pain. He built a stage on top of it. He turned the place of death into a place of celebration, as if volume could drown memory, as if applause could bury the sound of gunfire. But no matter how bright the ballroom lights were, the shadows outside were getting longer. The police were still watching. Federal investigators were still building. Rivals were still waiting. And somewhere near the edge of Fluky's circle, loyalty was beginning to rot from the inside. By the time Fluky Stokes was throwing money across ballrooms, the image he had built was beginning to crack. For years, he had survived by understanding the difference between what people knew and what people could prove. On the South Side, rumors followed him everywhere. Police watched him, investigators studied his movements. His name appeared again and again in conversations about money, violence, narcotics, gambling, and power. But suspicion is not a conviction, and Fluky understood that better than most. He had built a life inside the space between fear and silence. Witnesses were difficult to find, stories changed. People forgot details when the questions became dangerous. A man could be famous on the street and still almost invisible in court, as long as nobody was willing to carry the truth all the way to the witness stand. That was how Fluky kept walking. But the walls were moving closer. One of the most serious cases connected to him involved the killing of Robert Sarowski, a pharmacist whose business allegedly intersected with the world Fluky was accused of controlling. The case brought heavy charges, and for a moment, it looked like the kind of legal pressure even Fluky might not escape. Then the courtroom changed. Witnesses who were expected to support the case stepped back from their earlier claims. Statements shifted. Accusations weakened. What had seemed like a path toward conviction began to fall apart under the weight of recanted testimony and uncertainty, and Fluky walked out. To the public, it looked like another impossible escape, another reminder that this man could stand near the center of danger and still leave untouched. Reporters pressed him, cameras waited, the legend absorbed the moment the way it always had. Fluky did not look defeated. He looked like a man who had once again survived the machinery built to catch him. But this time, the escape was not the same as freedom. Because while one case weakened, federal investigators were building something larger. Not just one killing, not just one accusation. They were looking at patterns, money, taxes, racketeering, the structure of an alleged criminal enterprise. A single witness might collapse. A broader federal case could be harder to outrun. And Fluky knew the street was moving too. Old enemies did not disappear because a judge dismissed charges. Rivals did not forgive because a man smiled outside court. The same power that made Fluky famous also made him a target. The more untouchable he looked, the more valuable it became for someone to prove he was not. That is the danger of living as a legend. Every public escape creates private resentment. Every victory makes the next betrayal more tempting. And by late 1986, Fluky was surrounded by people who smiled close enough to touch him, but not all of them were loyal. The most dangerous man near him was not standing in front of his Cadillac. He was following behind it. Earl Wilson was supposed to be protection. That was the simple part of the arrangement. Fluky Stokes was a man with enemies, a man under pressure, a man who knew that power always attracted someone willing to test it. So a bodyguard was not decoration. A bodyguard was insurance. He was the person paid to watch the corners, read the street, notice the car that did not belong, and stand between danger and the man who had hired him. But Earl Wilson was not just standing near Fluky. He was standing between worlds. To Fluky, Wilson was security. To investigators, he had been useful as an informant. To men outside Fluky's circle, he became something even more valuable. A way in. That is what makes the betrayal so cold. Fluky had spent years building a life where people either feared him, needed him, owed him, or wanted access to him. But no empire is protected from the inside if the wrong person is close enough to know your movements, and Wilson was close. By the fall of 1986, Fluky was not moving through Chicago like a careless man. He knew there were enemies. He knew pressure was rising. He knew the old rules were breaking down. But on the night of November 18th, he still did something ordinary. He went to the movies with Diane Miller. Afterward, they stopped for food, then drove toward her apartment near 79th and Ellis. It should have been a simple night. That is why it feels so haunting. No ballroom, no funeral home, no crowd, no diamonds, no silk suit. Just a Cadillac moving through the city after midnight, carrying a man whose entire life had been built around being impossible to ignore. Behind him, Earl Wilson followed in another car. And according to prosecutors, Wilson was not simply following. He was communicating. He was giving information about where Fluky was going, where he would stop, when he would arrive. The bodyguard had become a guide for the people waiting in the dark. The price of that betrayal was almost unbelievable. Not a fortune, not a palace, not a share of an empire. Reports described a small bargain built around debt, favors, a stolen car phone, and phone bills. Around $800 in value. $800 against the life of one of the most feared men on the South Side. That number is what makes the story feel almost unreal. Fluky had thrown more money into the air at parties than the value attached to his betrayal. He had built a Cadillac Coffin for his son. He had worn diamonds like armor. He had made people believe his power was too large to measure. And yet the opening that led to his death could be measured in hundreds. At 12:37 in the morning, the Cadillac stopped. Diane Miller reached for grocery bags. Ronald Johnson sat in the front. Fluky was in the back, not dressed like a king, but like a man trying to move quietly through his own city. Then the gunman appeared. The attack was fast. The glass broke. The driver was hit. Fluky was hit. Diane stayed low and survived the chaos around her. And behind them, Earl Wilson fired his weapon. But not at the men attacking Fluky. He fired into the air. That single detail became one of the darkest symbols in the entire case. A bodyguard's gun went off, but protection never came. The men who stepped out of the shadows were able to leave. The man who had paid to be guarded was dying in the car that had helped define his legend. Later, Wilson would be arrested, tried, and convicted. Others suspected in the wider plot were never held responsible in the same way. The gunmen remained ghosts. The full machinery behind the killing never came fully into the light. And that leaves the betrayal feeling unfinished. Because the story is not only that Fluky Stokes was killed, the story is that a man who built his life on loyalty discovered, at the very end, how fragile loyalty really was. He had trusted money. He had trusted fear. He had trusted reputation. But on that night, none of those things stopped the person behind him from becoming the doorway through which death entered. A.R. Leak Funeral Home had already seen the Stokes legend once before. 2 years earlier, crowds had gathered there to see Willie the Wimp Stokes Jr. sitting behind the wheel of a Cadillac-shaped coffin, dressed for the afterlife like he was still part of the streets that had made his name. That funeral had become a story, then a song, then a piece of American folklore. Now the crowd returned for his father. Willie Fluky Stokes was gone. And once again, thousands came to look. The line outside the funeral home stretched with the weight of memory, curiosity, loyalty, and contradiction. Some people came because they had loved him. Some came because they feared him. Some came because they wanted to witness the ending of a man who had seemed too large to disappear in an ordinary way. That was the strange thing about Fluky. Even in death, he drew a crowd. Inside, he did not look like the man who had gone out quietly that final night. The street clothes were gone. The plainness of the murder scene was replaced by the image people expected from him. He was dressed in blue, surrounded by the kind of careful presentation that had followed him through life. The suit, the shirt, the tie, the shoes, the posture of a man who had built his name on being seen. And in his hands was a telephone. It was a small detail, but it carried the weight of the whole story. Fluky had reportedly been holding a phone when the attack came. In death, that symbol returned to him, placed between his fingers like one final object from the life he could not control at the end. His son had been placed behind the wheel. Fluky was placed with the phone. One image was motion. The other was connection. Both were illusions. Neither could bring them back. Outside, people remembered different versions of him. Some remembered the man who gave away money, shook hands, helped families, and made poor people feel noticed. Others remembered the fear around his name, the investigations, the violence connected to his world, and the damage left behind by the empire he was accused of running. That contradiction did not disappear at the funeral. It stood in line with everyone else, because Fluky Stokes was not mourned as a simple man. He was mourned as a symbol, and symbols are rarely clean. They hold everything at once: generosity, fear, grief, spectacle, loyalty, and ruin. 7,000 people came to say goodbye, but no crowd, no suit, no phone in his hand could change the truth. The king of the South Side had not been defeated in court. He had not been brought down by a public confession. He had not fallen because the world finally stopped believing in his image. He died in a Cadillac after midnight, betrayed from behind. And when the funeral ended, the legend did not vanish. It only became harder to explain. In the end, Willie "Fluky" Stokes left behind a story too complicated to fit into one label. To law enforcement, he was a suspected architect of a criminal empire. To parts of the South Side, he was the man who helped when no one else did. To newspapers, he was spectacle. To music, he became a footnote in a blues legend. To his family, he was something more private than any headline could capture. That is what makes the story so unsettling. Fluky's world was built on contradictions. He gave money to people who needed it, while investigators believed his power came from an industry that damaged countless lives. He turned grief into theater, then became the subject of another funeral just as unforgettable. He lived surrounded by loyalty, but died because loyalty failed at the closest possible distance. The Cadillac was supposed to represent style, control, and status. But in this story, it became something darker. A son was buried inside one. A father was killed inside one. And between them, a song carried the image farther than either man could have imagined. Maybe that is the real lesson of Fluky Stokes. A man can spend his whole life building an image strong enough to survive him, but he cannot choose what that image will mean once he is gone. Was he remembered as a benefactor, a criminal, a father broken by grief, a symbol of a violent era, or all of those things at once? The answer depends on who is telling the story. But one thing is certain, his empire did not end quietly. It ended with gunfire, a bodyguard's betrayal, a telephone in a dead man's hand, and the shadow of a Cadillac that still follows the legend wherever it goes.